Hello and welcome back to Third Spaces with Michelle. I'm Michelle, and this video is part 3 of a 3-part series where I'm talking about how at the age of 50 that I quit my life. And part 1 and part 2 are about the beginnings of that, starting in 2018 at 50 years old when I woke up with an epiphany that if I was unhappy in my life, that it was up to me to change it, and what led to a huge, massive change in a way of living that I could not have imagined even a decade ago, now in 2026. If you had told me what would transpire between 2018 and 2026, I would have said there's no way. So I'm sharing those stories today, and part 3 picks up in 2021. And a big part of this is going to be talking about how I gave away 95% of my things. And basically, I have now a small storage unit and live out of a 24-inch suitcase. So let's get into, the hows and the whys. I've had lots of questions over the last several years from people asking me, like, how did you do this? The actual logistics of doing it. And so that's the story today. So let's go. All right. So 2021 is where we're at, and we're in the summer of 2021. And I had been living in temporary spaces during the pandemic in Portland, Oregon. And the summer of 2021, I actually decided to go live in Tucson, Arizona, where I had lived from 1996 to 2006. I hadn't been there in a long time, and my son was living in Scottsdale, Arizona, which is 2.5 hours away. So I felt called to go to Tucson. And I very much in this time of my life, like listening to my intuition, and my thought was, I'll indulge in some nostalgia, revisit this place that felt so much like my true home in the world, even though I grew up in New England. Tucson really always felt like home, and it's where my son grew up. So I was feeling very much called to be there. And that was lovely. It was a little hot. People are like, you're going to the desert in summer, but it's what I did. But it was during that summer that I started having dreams about Italy. Yes, Italy. I had never been to Italy, and I hadn't even really considered Italy, which is strange because I'm such a big food and wine person. But that summer of 21, that very sleepy, still COVID, still shut down summer, I started seeing a lot of Italy content on my Instagram. And I was following this one person who I didn't know, who was in Italy that summer, and just kept talking about how Italy was like people hadn't seen it for decades, and that it was quiet of tourism, and what he was posting was so beautiful. And then I started dreaming about Italy. So towards the end of summer of August, I called my son and I said, I think I'm supposed to go to Italy. My son is used to this. If you've watched my other videos, my foray out to living internationally in a different country every month, my son's like, oh, interesting. And he said it was a little bit trepidatious, and maybe there was another big COVID spike, maybe just taking a pause and not going. And I said, oh yeah, I'll consider that, think about it. And then 2 weeks later, I just felt a very strong call to book an apartment in Italy. Now, this would be the first time that I really traveled completely alone to live in a country. And you can go back to my first and second videos about the company that I traveled with when I first went out into the world, called Remote Year, and how that worked. But this would be my first time internationally going and just living somewhere where I didn't speak the language and didn't have a community to speak of, or someone to reach out to, but just kind of all on my own. And I felt really good about it. And so when I was telling people about this, I had chosen for my first month of going to Italy. On my US visa, I could live there for up to 3 months. And I decided to go for the whole 3 months, but I just booked my first month and decided to go to Puglia. Now, a lot of people that I shared my plans with said, Puglia, you're not going to Rome or Venice, or you're going to Puglia. And I said, yeah, I'm just really called to go to Puglia. And there's several things about Puglia that, were concerning. They said, there's not a lot of English speakers. And I said, I'm really not worried about that. I'm happy to use my Google Translate, and I just felt really great about going to Italy in the fall of 2021. So I was leaving actually on my birthday, October 16th, and flying. I actually flew to London first, which also I had to jump through a million hoops because of COVID to do that. But I went to London for a few days and then proceeded to go to Puglia via a quick connection in Milan. And I'll do a separate video if you're all interested in this very specific 3 months, but I can't even tell you how magical it was, how absolutely wonderful from the moment I landed. And I just felt kind of led to places and things, and they were correct. Puglia was very much Italian speakers, and I cannot say enough about how welcome and friendly everyone was, and helpful and patient as I was learning phrases in Italian and trying to connect with people. I cannot say enough about how much I felt welcomed by the communities and everywhere that I went in Italy. So the story really kind of unfolds. I was very close to booking the apartment that I found in Bari, Italy, in Puglia, for the whole 3 months before I went, just to say, oh, I know I have a place to live and I can just kind of travel around Italy. And my inner voice said, no, absolutely not. Just book the first month. And I'm so thankful, because I ended up living my last 2 months in Florence, Italy, which was, I can't even speak to how magical and wonderful it was. But that really got me, those 3 months in Italy really gave me so much confidence, and really if you call it a bug or the passion or whatever was inside of me to do more of this living. I came back completely changed and just full of excitement to do more of that travel. But before I'd left on that trip, I actually had acquired a couple of new clients, and I was very much into that spring of 2022, helping them with their business on site. And so I was happy to be back in the US and Oregon, but I also had in my brain, I was leaving again in the autumn. And during that summer, I decided that I was going to go to Copenhagen, Denmark for the first month that I could stay in the Schengen. And then I would spend the next 2 months in Italy. And so that was my plan. And it was amazing. Again, if y'all put into the comments you want to hear more about living in these different places, I would be happy to make more videos. But for the purpose of this video of getting rid of my things, we're just going to kind of race through the timeline. I was just fully into and feeling more confidence about working and traveling and living in different cities. And during that winter of 22 that I was in Italy, my son came over to Italy, which was an amazing 10 days that we had there. Incredible. I was back in Florence, living in the apartment I had lived in the year before. Loved my neighborhood. It was wonderful. I felt like I lived there. I had made friends there the year before that I got together with. It was wonderful. And when my son was visiting, I said, that was in early December of 2022, and my time in the Schengen was going to be up by the middle of January. And I said, I'm not ready to go back in a place that I had been thinking about and dreaming about in that last year was Scotland, was Edinburgh, Scotland. And I kept looking at it. I kept looking at Edinburgh, and I really couldn't get a sense of where I should stay and what part of the city I should stay in. And when I was telling my son this, I said, I just haven't found like the right thing. I don't know enough about it. And while he was visiting me in Italy, we were going to be meeting up with a work associate of his. My son used to tour the world as a lighting designer, and we were meeting up with this producer who he had toured with, who I had met several times before, that we both really loved. And we were going to be going to see them because they were doing a show in Bologna. So my son said to me, you know, this producer has good friends in Edinburgh. You should ask her thoughts or to see if she can connect you with these people. So long story short is that immediately she was so generous and said, I'll send them an email right now. These people actually owned apartments in Edinburgh. They lived outside of Edinburgh, but they owned apartments in Edinburgh, and they were very happy to offer me a lovely winter rate in Edinburgh as soon as I was leaving Italy. So I ended up booking 2 months after Italy, booking to stay 2 months from January until March in Edinburgh. So I left Italy and went to the UK, went to Scotland, and I can't tell you, winter in Scotland, I fell in love with it the minute I got off the train in Edinburgh. I was like, oh my gosh, this is where I'm supposed to be. And I had the most wonderful, magical 2 months in, I know I keep saying that, but it's true. I had the most wonderful and magical 2 months in Edinburgh, and I knew, first of all, I didn't want to leave, and second of all, I knew that I would be back very soon. And I started planning immediately for a return in the autumn because my favorite season is autumn. And I thought to myself, if I love it here in the winter, I'm going to really love it in autumn. So I flew back to the US and I had some in-person commitments over the spring of 2023 with some clients. And I was doing more work remotely, but also was doing some things on site and really kind of balancing those things. But during my time in Scotland, I started thinking about what I wanted for the future. And one of the big things that, like a big, I guess I would call it kind of a burden, was my storage unit. I had this whole life that I had packed away in this large storage unit in 2018, not knowing everything that was going to transpire and thinking that at some point I would want to pick that life back up and I would want all of these things. And I knew that that wasn't the case anymore. And so it was time to get rid of the storage unit. So it did take me a while. I will tell you, resistance is real. Resistance is real. And I came up with so many excuses as to like why I wasn't starting to edit down to tackle the emptying of the storage unit. And then finally I was like, this isn't going to happen unless you do it. So I just started really small. In June of 2023, I started removing boxes from the storage unit. And this was a large storage unit. It had living room furniture, dining room furniture, bedroom furniture. It had so many things that I kind of had forgotten about because it had been packed away for 5 years. And all I did when I went in there was get in and out of my clothes boxes to change out the seasons, really. So it felt very overwhelming, but I just started really small. And for anyone who's thinking about even just editing down their life, it does feel extremely overwhelming. And my suggestion is start with one small thing. And I wrote about this on my Substack a few years ago about the Great Purge, I called it. And I started with these boxes full of journals. And I am a very committed journaler. I love to write by hand. I love to outline all of these posts and these videos by hand and writing stories. And I've always been a lifelong letter writer. And I had all of these journals, and I knew that some of them had some really dark stuff in there about times that I was really unhappy. And I just looked at them and I thought, I don't really need to read these again, and I don't think I need them. So that was my first part of purging, was ethically disposing of all of these journals. But at the time, I tried to buy journals that were recyclable and easily disposed of, but I did have some that weren't, that were a little bit plastic, and now I would really recommend just trying to go eco as much as possible. But I had to tear them out and by hand and then bring them to a shredder to be shredded where they were recycled. And that was a big process in itself. And then I just slowly started going through boxes and things and really identifying what I didn't need. And there was some grief to it. One of the biggest things that I had a problem with letting go of were the tons of books and cookbooks that I had, which I ended up giving a lot of them to friends. But I just knew that I pretty much knew then that I also really was thinking about leaving the United States, which hasn't happened 100%. I am not an expat yet. I knew deep down that I wasn't going to need those. And if I did, I would just go to a used bookstore and find the cookbooks that I wanted. There was a lot of grief. There was also some surprise at some of the things that were in my storage unit that I had decided to store. Clothes from 15 years ago that I was just carting around. And so I had some beautiful things that I gave to consignment shops that I just said, look, I'm never looking for the money from this. And if you can sell them. And then ethically disposing of electronics. It was more complex than I think that it should be. I really wasn't in any hurry, and it took me 2 months to dispose of the storage unit. I actually gave away a lot of my furniture. I had someone in my life who was a young single mom, and I had this beautiful, oh my gosh, I had this beautiful bed set, and I was so happy for her to take it. And I just gave it away. People were like, you should put it on Facebook Marketplace. And my stuff had been in storage for so long, I really couldn't photograph it. And I just was like, I paid for it a long time ago, and I'm just happy for someone to love it and use it. And that's just my thing. No, I'm not saying you need to give away your things, but that's just what I chose to do. And then I moved a few boxes, I want to say maybe 5 boxes, and one big storage tub that held all of my photographs and things from my son growing up and some art. And I just ended up with a small, like closet-sized storage unit for the last now almost 3 years. It was a big undertaking, but I'll tell you, it felt so good. The tiny bit of grief compared to the feeling of freedom was just huge. And when I was finished and that storage unit was empty, I can't even tell you the feeling of euphoria that I had. I was so incredibly happy. And again, just felt free. I had kind of been building up to this by living out of a 24-inch suitcase, 3 to 6 months out of the year. But by the end of August 2023, I was taking off again to go to Scotland that autumn. And I didn't know what was going to happen, but here's what happened. Again, kind of freeing myself made opportunities come into play. And I left that autumn and went to Scotland for 6 or 7 weeks, which was wonderful and even more solidified my love for it. Then I went to Italy for 3 months. And this time I went to Turin, which I absolutely fell in love with. I had never been to Turin, and split my time between Turin and Florence. And it was while I was in Turin, again, I was like, I don't want to go back to the US after my 3 months in Italy. But that same person who introduced me into the folks in Scotland ended up messaging me. I hadn't seen her, so that was 2 years, or no, it had been a year earlier that we had seen her in Italy. I got a message from her saying, Zach mentioned that you might be open to house sitting for me while I'm touring, and here are the dates. And it was literally the same week that I needed to leave Italy that she asked me to arrive in Melbourne, Australia. And I was like, yes, absolutely. So I flew from Rome, actually flew out of Rome and flew to Melbourne in January of 2024. And I stayed in Melbourne, which I had never been to Melbourne before. I'd been to Australia once, which had been my dream in 2008 when friends of mine from the States were living there for a couple of years, and they lived in Sydney in Bondi Beach. But I hadn't been back. I'd never been to Melbourne. So I had this opportunity to live there from January until May. And I actually spent 3 weeks in New Zealand, which also I'd never been to. While I was in Melbourne, in that winter of January to May 2024, I connected with someone that I had met at a wine bar in Florence that past winter. One day, we just met at my favorite wine bar in Florence and really hit it off and exchanged information. And we ended up having a Zoom. This woman who also traveled the world with the business that she had, but she and her daughter shared an apartment in Paris. And she messaged me and said, I don't know if this interests you, but my daughter is going to be leaving for the summer, spring and summer, and we're looking for someone who might want to rent the apartment. Are you interested? Paris in spring, in summer. I'd never been to Paris. And I just said yes. It fit with my budget, and I was just, what an amazing opportunity. So I went from Melbourne to Paris that summer and was in Paris from May until July. And I came back to the US for about 6 to 8 weeks. No, not 8 quite, probably 6 weeks following Paris, really to change out my suitcase, and then went back to Scotland, and then back to Italy. And that was kind of my routine it was my 4th winter in Italy, my 3rd time in Scotland. And when I was done in Italy, I decided, no, I'm not going back to the States. And I ended up spending a month, the 1st of 2025, January until March, in this incredible town in the UK, gorgeous little town. Then I went to Scotland, and I stayed in Scotland from March until the end of July. And then I went back to the States for 6 weeks, and then I left and came back here to Melbourne in September of 2025. I've been here since then, which has been amazing. And I've also been in New Zealand, just really spending time down here in the Southern Hemisphere. I've spent spring, summer, and now we're in autumn here in April, and I'm in this beautiful place. But this has just been kind of me putting myself out there and opportunities showing up. And ever since I purged the storage unit, it just has felt like even more freedom to say yes to these things. It's been incredible. And again, if you had told me in 2016, this is what your life is going to look like, I would have said, there's no way. Because I would not have been able to wrap my head around the how. And this is what I've learned. I don't need to know the how. I do not, the universe will show up and present opportunities. And I don't need to know the how for my dreams. And they may not turn out exactly like I thought. Actually, the dreams I had of living remotely and traveling were so much more constricted because I thought there's no way that I could do this without these things needing to happen. And all of that is just restriction. So I would say kind of lose expectations, because so much more wonderful things can happen if you don't box yourself in, if that makes sense. So that brings us up to date to now in the part 3 of 3 of quitting my life. My life looks so different. And what I'll see here at the end is big. The last few months has been this huge feeling of change inside me again. Like a big change is coming. It's part of the reason of doing these YouTube videos, that I'm being called to showing up different in the world. Getting my death doula certification last year was incredibly impactful for me as a person and how I would like to be of service in the world, and just really leaning into how the world is changing. Being called to create this channel in a way of really the pillars of it being community, connection, and creative health, and trying to find my people and serve them with, my different offerings. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for sticking with me and listening and hearing my story. And I have a question for you. What do you think about getting rid of all of your things? What does hearing my story, what does that bring up for you? Like, oh my gosh, I want to get rid of my stuff. No, I could never get rid of my stuff. I'd love to live out of a 24-inch suitcase. I know I asked this in one of my other videos as well, but I'm very keen to hear, if you could just go live somewhere for 6 months, where would you go and why? What draws you to that place and what's stopping you? And believe me, I totally understand that not everybody can take their job remote, but my experiences in meeting people out here in this travel world, I've seen it's more possible, and it's more possible than I ever thought. So I'd love to hear from you. Please drop into the comments below where you would love to live for 6 months or a year or even a month, just to test it out. And yeah. Also, before you go, if you could like and subscribe, I would be so grateful. I would love for people to find it. And if you feel like you want to share it, I'd also be grateful for that too. So thank you. Thank you so much, friends, for being here. Coming up, we're going to have the first reading room. So excited getting that video shot and starting to make a space, like a quiet, safe space where we can just read together. Reading's under attack in the whole world, and I just want to spend some time with the community in a quiet space reading and talking about books after. Oh my gosh, I am so keen to create a community to talk about books and storytelling. So stay tuned for the reading room. And yeah, until next time, stay safe, and I will see you soon. Bye for now.